I've never told this story to anyone in detail. Not because I don't want to, but because whenever I start, people laugh and assume I'm exaggerating. Maybe you will too. But I swear, what I experienced in that motel outside Flagstaff, Arizona still haunts me every single night I try to close my eyes. Back in 2014, I was driving cross-country. My plan was to take old Route 66 from Chicago all the way to Los Angeles. It wasn't for work or anything noble like soul-searching. It was just a personal bucket list trip. I was in my mid-20s, restless, and going through the kind of heartbreak that makes you want to disappear for a while. That night, after nearly 12 hours of driving, my GPS led me off the main highway and onto a 2-lane road cutting through the desert. There were no big-name hotels anywhere around, just endless stretches of sand and cactus. I was exhausted, and when I spotted a flickering neon sign that read, "Desert Moon Motel Vacancy," I didn't think twice. The building looked ancient, single-story, U-shaped, with about 12 rooms facing a cracked parking lot. The office door was propped open, and a small bell jingled when I stepped inside. Behind the counter was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His greasy hair clung to his forehead, his eyes had deep purple bags beneath them, and his smile was oddly forced, like he was practicing how to look friendly. "You just passing through?" he asked, voice raspy. "Yeah," I said. "Just need a room for the night." He hesitated, glanced at the wall of keys, then slowly took down one marked room 6. His hand lingered on it, almost like he didn't want to give it to me. "Cash only," he muttered. $80. That should have been my first red flag, but exhaustion makes you careless. I handed him the bills, grabbed the key, and drove my car around to room 6. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a roadside motel. Faded carpet, an old box TV, and that faint, musty smell of mildew mixed with cigarette smoke. But what caught my attention were the curtains. They weren't the usual motel beige or brown. These were deep crimson red, heavy velvet fabric, the kind you'd see in a theater, not in some cheap desert inn. I remember thinking it was weird, but I was too tired to care. I set my bags down, showered in the grimy bathroom, and collapsed onto the creaky bed. That's when things started to get strange. At around 1:30 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The room was freezing cold, colder than the desert night should have been. I checked the thermostat. It was off. Then I noticed something. The curtains were swaying, ever so slightly, like someone had brushed past them. I froze. The window was shut. The AC wasn't on. There was no draft. Lying in bed, I stared at those red curtains, half expecting someone to step out from behind them. My heart hammered, but after 10 minutes of nothing happening, I convinced myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks. I rolled over, shut my eyes, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The second time I woke, it was to the sound of whispering. I couldn't make out the words, just soft, rapid murmurs like several voices speaking at once. The sound was coming from near the curtains. My skin went cold. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. The whispers grew louder, overlapping each other until they stopped all at once. I reached for the lamp and flicked it on. The curtains weren't swaying anymore. But, I swear to God, for just a second, I thought I saw the outline of a face pressing from behind the fabric. Pale skin, hollow eyes, then gone. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I marched straight to the front office. The man behind the desk looked worse than before, like he hadn't moved all night. His eyes flicked to my room key before I even said a word. "Everything okay in room 6?" he asked. I almost told him about the whispers, the face, the freezing cold. But something in the way he asked, too casual, like he already knew, made me stop. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Yeah, just fine." I checked out and drove off, vowing never to return. But here's where the story should have ended. It didn't. 2 months later, back in Chicago, I got curious. I typed Desert Moon Motel Flagstaff into Google. The first result was a local news article dated 2001. The headline made my stomach drop. Motel murder, woman found dead, behind room 6 curtains. Her name was Melissa Grant. A 29-year-old traveler, strangled and hidden behind those heavy red drapes. The killer was never caught. The article mentioned one disturbing detail. Guests who stayed in room 6 after the murder complained of hearing voices at night and feeling watched. Some even claimed to see Melissa's face pressed against the curtains. My blood ran cold. But here's the part that still keeps me awake. I dug deeper, scrolling through old forums and archived blogs. I found a post from a trucker dated 2010. He said he stayed in room 6 and saw something different, not a woman. He described a man's face, pale, hollow-eyed, watching from behind the curtain. Another guest in 2012 said the same, not Melissa, a man. And then I realized something that made me want to vomit. When I saw that face pressing against the fabric, it wasn't a woman's. It was a man's. But the killer was never caught. Which means, what if he's still there? What if he never left the motel at all? What if those curtains don't hide Melissa's spirit, but the man who killed her? I swear, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the whispers. And sometimes, I think they're not coming from my memory at all. Sometimes I think they're still coming from behind those red curtains. I used to work the night shift at a small roadside motel in New Mexico back in 2009. I was 21, broke, and had just dropped out of community college. The job wasn't glamorous, mostly just checking in the occasional trucker, restocking the vending machine, and making sure no one trashed the rooms. But the one thing I'll never forget is the night something walked into the lobby, something that shouldn't have been there at all. The motel was called Sundown Inn. It sat right off Interstate 40, surrounded by nothing but desert, scrub brush, and a gas station across the road that closed by midnight. That stretch of highway was lonely at night. Once traffic died down, it was just silence, broken only by the buzz of the neon vacancy sign outside and the occasional rumble of an 18-wheeler speeding past. Most nights, I'd sit behind the counter with a paperback or an old radio playing static-filled country music. The office had this glass front that looked out at the parking lot, and sometimes when I was bored, I'd stare at the reflection instead of the empty desert. You'd be surprised how easy it is to freak yourself out in that kind of silence. That night, it must have been close to 3 a.m., I was half asleep in the chair when I heard the lobby door creak open. I jolted upright, expecting to see some weary traveler. Instead, I saw a man standing in the doorway completely still. He didn't walk in right away. He just stood there, framed by the buzzing neon light. I remember every detail about him: long black coat, dust-covered boots, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low enough that I couldn't see his eyes. His clothes looked old-fashioned, not like a costume, but genuinely worn from another time. His skin was pale, almost gray, and when he finally stepped into the light of the lobby, I noticed his lips were cracked and dry as if he hadn't had water in days. "Need a room?" I asked, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. He didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly like he was studying me. After a long pause, he rasped, "Room 13. Here's the thing. We didn't have a room 13. The motel only had 12 rooms. I laughed nervously and said, "Sorry, sir, no room 13 here, just 12. The man's cracked lips stretched into the faintest smile. 13, he repeated, firmer this time. I should have told him to leave. I should have locked the door. But instead, I reached for the key rack behind me, as if checking to prove my point. Sure enough, there was no key labeled 13. When I turned back, the man was gone. The lobby door hadn't opened. The bell above it hadn't jingled. He had just vanished. I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself it was exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination. Working the night shift does things to your brain. I didn't even tell my manager the next day. But the story doesn't end there. 2 nights later, A couple checked into room 7. Around 2 a.m., the woman came storming into the lobby, shaking, clutching her husband's arm. "There's someone outside our window," she said, breathless. I grabbed the flashlight and went with them back to their room. Sure enough, the window screen was bent and the curtains were swaying, but there were no footprints in the dirt outside, just undisturbed desert sand. The couple insisted they'd seen a man in a long black coat and hat standing at the glass watching them. I didn't sleep the rest of that shift. Over the next month, it kept happening. Different guests in different rooms, all claiming to see the same man. Always at night. Always silent. Always gone by the time anyone looked outside. One trucker even left in the middle of the night, throwing his keys on the counter and muttering, "You didn't warn me." Warn him about what? I didn't know. At least not yet. Curiosity got the better of me. I started asking around. Locals, older employees, anyone who might know. That's when I learned the motel had been built in the early 70s, right on top of the ruins of an older roadside inn. The original inn had burned down in the 1950s after a mysterious fire killed several guests. One of them was a traveling salesman, found charred beyond recognition in what was recorded as room 13. But here's where it gets darker. I eventually found a microfilm copy of the old newspaper article in the town library. It mentioned something chilling. Witnesses swore they saw the salesman walking the halls even after the fire had been extinguished, standing in doorways, watching. The Sundown Inn never had a room 13, but maybe he thought it did. Maybe he's still looking for it. The last time I worked that shift before quitting, I swear on everything I saw him again. This time it wasn't through the lobby door. It wasn't in the reflection of the glass. It was in the hallway, standing directly in front of room 7. I froze, gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The beam of light landed on him, but his shadow didn't fall against the wall. His hat tilted slowly toward me, and for the first time I saw his eyes. They weren't human. They were black, bottomless. And when he whispered, I swear it wasn't English. It was something older, something that made my stomach twist in ways I can't explain. I turned and ran. The next day, I quit. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and pass by old motels, I glance at the windows, and every now and then I swear I see him, standing there, waiting, and I always wonder, if one night I make the mistake of pulling in, would he finally lead me to room 13? I grew up in Kansas, and back when I was fresh out of high school, I took a job cleaning rooms at a run-down roadside motel called Pioneer Lodge. It was the kind of place that had been there forever, sun-bleached signs, a pool long since drained, and rooms with shag carpet older than I was. Truckers and drifters mostly stayed there, sometimes families passing through if they were desperate, but no one ever lingered. The place felt temporary, like a halfway point between nowhere and somewhere else. I didn't mind the job at first. It was quiet, easy work, just vacuuming, scrubbing bathrooms, changing sheets. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something strange. One particular room, room 9, was never available to guests. The manager, an older guy named Carl, always skipped over it when assigning cleaning duties. When I asked about it, he just said, "Don't worry about 9, it's not in use." At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it had plumbing issues or was being renovated. But the more I worked there, the more room 9 started to bother me. Every time I pushed my cleaning cart past it, I'd swear I could feel cold air seeping from the crack under the door. The hallway could be boiling hot in the summer, but that strip of space by room 9 always felt icy, like someone had left the AC blasting inside. One afternoon, when Carl stepped out for a smoke, I decided to peek. The door wasn't locked, just shut. I turned the knob and slipped inside. The smell hit me first, damp, stale, like wet earth mixed with mildew. The curtains were drawn tight, but even in the dim light, I could see that the room hadn't been cleaned in years. Dust coated the furniture. The carpet was stiff and discolored. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted as if someone had just climbed out. On the nightstand, there was a half-empty glass of water. That detail made my stomach turn. It hadn't been touched by dust. The water was clear, fresh. I backed out quickly, telling myself Carl probably used the room to crash during long shifts. But something about the atmosphere in there didn't feel like sleep. It felt like a presence. I didn't say anything for weeks. But then, one morning, I came in early and found Carl in the lobby, looking pale and tired. A woman had checked out abruptly in the middle of the night, leaving her key behind without explanation. She said she couldn't stay another minute, Carl muttered, more to himself than to me. Said she saw someone standing in her room. When I asked which room she had stayed in, he hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the row of keys on the wall. Room 8, the room right next to room 9. From that night on, I started paying attention. Guests who stayed in 7 or 8 rarely lasted long. They'd complain of cold drafts, knocks on the wall, or voices at night. One man stormed into the lobby at 2 a.m., insisting there was a man sitting in the chair by his bed when he woke up. Carl refunded him and pretended to brush it off, but I could tell by the way his hands shook that he wasn't surprised. Finally, I pressed him. "What's in room 9?" I asked. He stared at me for a long time, then sighed. "You want the truth?" Back in the 70s, a traveling salesman checked in. No one ever saw him check out. When the maid went to clean, she found him dead in the bed. Heart attack, maybe. But here's the thing. He was sitting upright, eyes open, like he'd been waiting for something. Carl rubbed his temples, his voice low. "We closed off the room after that, but people keep seeing him. They say he walks the halls, peeks through the curtains, even sits at the edge of their beds." I wanted to laugh it off, but I couldn't. Not after what I had seen in room 9. Not after the untouched water glass. One evening, as the sun was setting and the guests were filtering into their rooms, I lingered in the hallway outside 9. The air was cold again, unnaturally so. I pressed my ear to the door. At first, silence. Then, faint breathing. Slow, steady, ragged. My heart pounded. I pulled back and nearly ran, but something compelled me to try the knob again. This time, when I turned it, the door resisted, as if someone on the other side was holding it shut. That night, I dreamt of a man in a wrinkled suit sitting on the bed in room 9, staring at the door with wide, glassy eyes. His lips were blue, his hands twitching, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't words. It was a low, guttural moan that rattled my bones. I woke up drenched in sweat. The next day, Carl told me room 9 had been sealed for good. He nailed the door shut, boarded the window from the inside, and even moved a dresser in front of it. "No one goes in, not anymore," he said firmly. I quit not long after, but even now, years later, when I drive through that stretch of Kansas, I feel the urge to stop by and see if the Pioneer Lodge still stands. Because the truth is, I don't think sealing that door kept him inside. Sometimes, late at night when I'm staying at motels during long trips, I wake to the sound of steady breathing in the dark. And I know, deep down, that the guest from room 9 never really checked out. I used to travel constantly for work, crisscrossing the country as a regional sales rep. Between airports and freeways, I practically lived in motels for years. Most were forgettable. Cheap mattresses, bad coffee, the kind of places you never think about again. But there's one night I can't shake, no matter how much time passes. It happened at a small roadside motel in Missouri, and every time I close my eyes, I see her standing there in the parking lot, waiting for me to acknowledge her. It was late autumn, already dark by the time I pulled off the interstate. I'd been driving for 8 straight hours and my eyes felt like sandpaper. The motel I found was nothing special. A squat L-shaped building with faded paint and a buzzing neon sign that read, "Rest Easy Inn." The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars. Inside the office, a middle-aged woman sat behind the counter, chain smoking, ashtray overflowing. She barely looked at me as she slid the key across the counter. "Room 11, she muttered. No smile, no small talk, just like she couldn't wait for me to leave. Room 11 was at the far end of the row, near a flickering street lamp that barely lit the asphalt. The room itself was typical. Faded floral bedspread, squeaky bathroom faucet, old TV with static channels. Nothing unusual. I dropped my bags, showered quickly, and crawled into bed. I must have fallen asleep instantly, but sometime after midnight I woke up to a sound that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a bang or a knock. It was softer, like the crunch of gravel under slow footsteps. I sat up, listening. The sound came again, deliberate, measured. Someone was walking across the parking lot. I pushed the curtain aside just a fraction and peeked out. That's when I saw her. A woman stood under the flickering street lamp. She wore a pale nightgown that fluttered in the breeze, her hair long and tangled, face obscured by shadows. She wasn't moving, wasn't pacing. She was just standing there, perfectly still, head tilted slightly toward my room. My first thought was that maybe she was another guest. Maybe she'd locked herself out or was waiting for someone to pick her up. But there was something about the way she stood, unnaturally rigid, arms hanging limp at her sides, that made my throat go dry. I watched for several minutes, waiting for her to walk away or wave for help. She didn't. She just stood there, staring at room 11. Finally, I let the curtain drop and tried to shake it off. Exhaustion was messing with me. But when I lay back down, I couldn't stop picturing her. Every creak of the motel walls, every gust of wind against the window, I thought it was her moving closer. Sometime later, maybe an hour, I woke again. This time the sound wasn't footsteps. It was scratching. Soft, deliberate, slow scratching at my door. My pulse thundered in my ears. I sat frozen, listening as the sound dragged against the wood, paused, then came again. I forced myself to peek through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. Whoever was out there knew exactly where to stand. I almost called the front desk, but something told me not to. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to admit what I thought was happening. The scratching went on for what felt like forever. Then silence. When morning finally came, I stumbled out of the room, bleary-eyed and shaking. The parking lot was empty, the street lamp off. But right at my door, in the dust on the ground, I saw faint footprints, bare feet, small, delicate. I told myself it was just a guest messing around, maybe someone drunk or unstable. I even forced a laugh as I loaded my suitcase into the car. But just as I was about to drive away, I noticed something that turned my blood cold. Near the back of the lot was an old, weathered bulletin board covered in flyers. Lost pets, local events, garage sales. Among them, one faded photo caught my eye. It was a missing person notice, dated 1987. The photo showed a young woman with long hair wearing a pale nightgown. The caption beneath read, "Last seen near Rest Easy Inn. If you have information, please contact." My stomach flipped. It had been decades since she vanished, and yet I had seen her, standing under that street lamp, watching me. I drove off without looking back, but even now, whenever I check into a motel, I make sure the parking lot is empty. And still, some nights, I wake to the faint sound of gravel crunching outside my window, and I know deep down she's still looking for room 11. Back in 2011, I took a road trip from Dallas up to Denver. I wasn't in any kind of rush, so I decided to stay at cheap motels along the way rather than chain hotels. My budget was tight, and honestly, part of me liked the idea of authentic roadside America, quirky old motels with neon signs and stories buried in their walls. That romanticized idea ended the night I stopped at a 2-story place outside of Amarillo, Texas. Its sign read, High Plains Lodge, letters flickering with only 2 cars parked out front. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. The man at the desk looked up from an old black and white TV, grunted, and handed me a key. No ID check, no credit card, just cash. The key was for room 14, upstairs at the end of the row. I remember the carpet on the stairs was so worn down in the middle that it felt like walking on bare wood. The room was plain but serviceable. Queen bed, mustard-colored curtains, a TV bolted to the dresser. The only thing I noticed right away was the vent above the bed. It was old, with a rusted grate, and it hummed faintly like something was still running behind it. The air coming out was cool even though the thermostat was off. After driving all day, I passed out fast. But sometime in the night, I woke to the faint sound of a voice. At first I thought it was someone outside, maybe a couple arguing in the parking lot. But as my ears adjusted, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside at all. It was coming from the vent. I sat up in bed, heart thudding, and listened. The voice was soft, like a whisper, but too muffled to make out words. I leaned closer, straining to catch it. After a few moments, it grew clearer, like the person on the other side had moved closer too. "Help me," the voice whispered. I stumbled back, my whole body cold. It wasn't a scream or a moan, it was calm, almost conversational, like someone sitting right behind the wall, speaking directly to me. I told myself it had to be a prank. Maybe the walls were thin, and I was hearing another guest through the ductwork. But when I pressed my ear to the grate, I could hear something else. Breathing. Slow. Ragged. Too close. I shut off the light, crawled back into bed, and pulled the blanket over my head like a child. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking again to the same voice. This time it was louder, clearer. "Room 14, it said. My room. My number. My blood went cold. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the vent, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. In the morning when I checked out, I decided to casually mention it to the desk clerk, a younger guy, maybe the owner's son. I laughed nervously and said, "Hey, weird thing. I think someone's messing with the vents in room 14. I kept hearing a voice in there last night." The kid froze, his expression tightening. "You heard it?" His reaction made my stomach sink. "Heard what?" I asked carefully. He looked around the lobby, then lowered his voice. "There's no guest next to 14. The other room on that wall, room 15, has been locked up for years. We don't rent it out." I asked why, but he shook his head. "You don't want to know." That answer haunted me all day as I drove. I almost convinced myself he was screwing with me. But a week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up High Plains Lodge Amarillo online. Buried in old news archives, I found it. In 1998, a man staying in room 15 had gone missing. Never checked out. Police found his belongings still inside: wallet, clothes, shoes. But no sign of him. The only clue they had was a neighbor's statement. She reported hearing his voice through the vent the night he vanished. Now, more than a decade later, I had heard the same thing. I still dream about that voice sometimes. Calm, quiet, always the same words. "Help me." And in the dream, I always walk closer to the vent. I always lean in. And I know one night, if I listen long enough, the voice will finally tell me where he went. Or worse, ask me to follow. In the summer of 2015, I was moving cross-country from Florida to Oregon. It was a long, lonely drive, and by the time I hit Oklahoma, I was exhausted and desperate for a place to crash. I pulled off the highway into a small town that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. One main street, a few boarded-up shops, and a neon sign glowing vacancy above a squat little motel. The sign read, "Sunset Haven." The name sounded comforting, but the building itself gave me the opposite feeling. The lobby was lit by a single yellow bulb that flickered every few seconds. The woman at the desk looked half asleep, chain-smoking a cigarette while filling out a crossword puzzle. She barely looked at me when I asked for a room, just slid over a key attached to one of those plastic tags that said, "Room 9. She didn't ask for ID, didn't ask how long I was staying. The whole exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but something about her eyes stuck with me. Tired, yes, but also watchful. Like she wanted me gone quickly before I could ask questions. Room 9 was at the far end of the building. The door stuck when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Not mildew exactly, but a kind of stale, heavy air, like no one had opened a window in years. I flicked on the light. The room was bare. One bed, a dresser, a TV that looked older than me, and a single lamp in the corner. But what I noticed almost immediately was the absence of something. There were no mirrors, not on the wall, not above the dresser, not in the bathroom. Nowhere. Every hotel room I'd ever stayed in had at least one mirror, usually more. This one didn't have a single reflective surface. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe they'd broken and hadn't been replaced. I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and fell asleep fully clothed. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I woke up with the strange, pressing sense that someone was watching me. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and that's when I noticed something that froze me. The TV screen, which had been off when I went to bed, was glowing faintly. Not showing static, not even turned on properly, just faintly glowing, like a black mirror catching the light from somewhere else. And in that faint glow, I saw a reflection. At first I thought it was just me, but when I sat up in bed, the reflection didn't move. It stayed lying down. I went cold all over. My first instinct was to grab my bag and leave, but something about the stillness of that reflection rooted me in place. I just sat there staring. Then it moved. Not quickly, not suddenly, but slowly, as if the person in the screen was waking up too. I watched as the other me rolled its head to the side and stared straight at me. That broke me. I lunged forward, yanked the cord out of the wall, and the screen went dark. No glow. No reflection. Just silence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep again. I sat up until dawn, watching that blank TV, half expecting the screen to flicker back to life on its own. When I returned the key the next morning, I tried to joke about it to the clerk. I said, "Weirdest thing, but room 9 doesn't have any mirrors. Is that on purpose?" She didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just exhaled smoke and said flatly, "That room doesn't need mirrors." I asked her what she meant and she shook her head. "Don't worry about it. You won't be staying again." And she was right. I never did. But sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night and catch my reflection in the dark screen of my own TV, I remember the way that other version of me turned its head. And I wonder if, one night, it'll do more than just look. Back in 2012, I was driving from Denver to Phoenix to meet up with an old college friend. I had planned to do the trip in one go, but about halfway through, exhaustion caught up with me. My eyes were burning, my head nodding, and I knew if I pushed it any further, I'd risk falling asleep at the wheel. So I pulled off into a small desert town I'd never even heard of. It barely looked like a town at all, just a gas station, a diner, and one old 2-story motel sitting on the edge of the highway, like it had been forgotten there decades ago. The sign was so faded I could barely make out the name, but I figured a bed was a bed. The clerk at the front desk was a gaunt, sunburned man with yellowed eyes. He hardly spoke. Just slid a guest book toward me, tapped the pen, and once I signed my name, he handed me a key on a heavy brass ring. The tag said, "Room 11. I was too tired to notice how strange his silence felt at the time, too focused on the thought of getting some rest. The room itself was nothing special. Scratchy carpet, buzzing fluorescent light, a window that faced the desert with curtains that didn't quite shut. But it was clean enough, and that was all I needed. I dropped onto the bed and let myself sink into it. It was maybe 2 hours later when I woke. Not because of a nightmare, but because of a sound. A steady, rhythmic thumping against the wall. At first I thought it might be pipes or maybe someone having sex in the room next door. But it didn't sound like that. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Like someone was slamming their hand or their head against the wall over and over again. I pressed my ear to the wall. The sound was definitely coming from the room next door. I checked the room number painted on the doorframe earlier. It had been room 12. I told myself it wasn't my problem. People get drunk, People do weird stuff in motels, people fight. I climbed back into bed and tried to ignore it. But then came the whisper. It wasn't muffled like the thumping. It was clear. A voice, low, raspy, strained, slipping through the thin wall as though the person was speaking right into my ear. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough. Help. Me. I froze. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I wanted to get up, to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, listening to the voice plead in broken fragments. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat up in bed, staring at the wall, waiting for it to start again. The next morning I went to check out. The clerk was still there, same blank face, same yellow eyes. I decided to bring it up casually, like maybe I hadn't heard right. I said, "Hey, is someone staying in room 12? They were making a lot of noise last night." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "Room 12's been locked for years, no one stays in there." I tried to laugh, but his face didn't change. He slid my receipt across the counter, and I got out of there as fast as I could. Later that day, when I stopped at a gas station outside town, curiosity got the better of me. I mentioned the motel to the attendant, described the faded sign, the sunburned clerk, and the room numbers. The attendant went pale. He said, "That place? It burned down in the late 90s. Took out half the top floor, including room 12. Killed a man inside who couldn't get out." I asked him when it was rebuilt. He shook his head. It wasn't. The building's been abandoned ever since. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I had stayed there just the night before, that I had the receipt in my pocket to prove it. But when I reached for it, the paper was gone. Just the empty fold of my wallet where I'd tucked it. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever signed their name in that guest book, or if somehow I was the only one who ever checked in after midnight. I never used to believe in curses. Ghost stories, sure, they were entertaining, but I always chalked them up to people letting their imagination run wild. That changed in the spring of 2019 when a business trip had me driving through the empty back roads of New Mexico. The route was long, isolated, and by midnight my eyelids were heavy and my phone had no signal. When I saw the neon sign glowing faintly through the desert haze, I felt almost relieved. It was one of those roadside motels that looked like it had been stuck in the 1960s. Peeling paint, a row of identical doors, and a reception office with a flickering "open" sign. The place was called the Silver Star Inn. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and dust. A bell rang when I stepped up to the desk, and from the back came a man in a faded brown uniform. His hair was slicked down, his face pale and gaunt, but his smile was practiced, like it had been painted on years ago and never washed away. "Traveling alone?" he asked, his voice strangely formal, like he was rehearsing lines from a script. I nodded, and he handed me a brass key without asking for payment. The tag said room 6. I thought it odd, but I was too exhausted to argue. The room was plain. Single bed, old wallpaper with water stains, a chair pushed against the wall. What unsettled me wasn't the room itself, but the way the window curtains had already been drawn tight, as if someone knew I'd be arriving. I crawled under the covers anyway, convincing myself I was just tired and let sleep take me. But sometime during the night, I woke to the sound of someone unlocking the door. The metallic scrape of the key sliding into the knob was unmistakable. My body froze in place. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The door creaked open, and in the thin sliver of moonlight, I saw a shadow step inside. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long. Its head bent as though it didn't quite fit inside the frame of the doorway. The shadow didn't move toward me. Instead, it went to the chair, the one pressed against the wall, and sat down. I could hear the wood strain beneath its weight. Then silence. I lay there for hours, paralyzed with fear, watching the dark shape sit in the corner, unmoving, until dawn broke and the room filled with light. And then, it was gone. Just the empty chair, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Shaking, I grabbed my bag and rushed to the front desk. The man was waiting there, that same hollow smile plastered on his face. Before I could say anything, he slid a guest book toward me. "Sign before you go," he said. I glanced down at the book, and my stomach twisted. The pages weren't filled with names and dates. They were filled with the same message, written over and over in hundreds of different handwritings. "Don't stay in room 6. I shoved the book back, stammering something about an emergency, and bolted. My car felt like a lifeline. I started the engine and didn't look back until I was miles away. But even then, in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw the silhouette of that long-limbed figure standing in the doorway of room 6, watching me leave. Here's the part that still keeps me up at night. A week later, back home, curiosity gnawed at me. I searched for the Silver Star Inn online. There was nothing. No listing, no reviews, not even a scrap of old history. I thought maybe I had the name wrong. I looked up abandoned motels along that route, and finally I found something, a newspaper clipping from 1972. The Silver Star Inn had burned down after a series of unexplained deaths. The article said the motel had been condemned and demolished decades ago. Room 6, according to the piece, was where they had found the body of the night clerk, hanging from the ceiling, his neck snapped, with a guest book clutched in his hands. I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, as some strange dream I'd mistaken for memory. But when I opened my suitcase later that night, tucked between my clothes was a scrap of yellowed paper, brittle with age. It wasn't mine. I never packed it. On it, in a handwriting that wasn't my own, were 5 words. "See you next check-in."